Chapter 21 On the Trail. The caravan mistress had more tenacity than Kendra could have given her credit for. The trail that she had carved through the wilderness was harsh and relentless. Even Caleb seemed taken aback. They moved quickly throughout the day until he came up short and grimaced. "I can't follow the trail any further in the dark," he admitted irritably. "The ground here is stony and hard. There's damn near no footprints, and precious little to indicate her passing. We'll have to wait until first light to even try to pick it up again." He gestured up to a rocky escarpment over a mile long, pulling up into a sloping plateau. Somewhere, lost in the setting sun, it rose a ways off into an angular peak. "If we camp here at the base of this hill, it should give us some protection from the wind, and keep prying eyes off us." Kendra nodded, still catching her breath. In truth, she was not half as tired as she would have expected, but she was ravenously hungry. "Incredible work, Caleb," she said brightly, shooting him a grateful smile. It was a small and practiced thing that did not overmuch contort her scarred cheeks. "At this rate, we'll catch up to her in no time. She's a middle-aged woman in unfamiliar terrain. I'm sure we're gaining on her. We must be." He looked away, troubled, considering the setting sun. "I hope so," he murmured pensively. "The pace she's setting is almost unbelievable. It's impressive for an experienced woodsman like myself. For her, it should be practically impossible. A trail like this says one thing to me. She's terrified. Something has her moving like her life depends on it." She felt a chill crawl up her back, but shook herself. There was no good thinking like that now. "Come on," she said warily. "I want to have a look into that package Medusa left us." As it turned out, Medusa was as deft a hand in the kitchen as she was in her garden. She had set them off with a basket bursting at the brims with the fruits of her labors, and Kendra had been drooling all day to think of them. After stoking a fire, much to Maya's amusement, Kendra opened the bundle eagerly, and still could not suppress her gasp of delight. She beheld it in the flickering light of the flames and under a vast cathedral of stars, and nonetheless she was, for a moment, home. There were burstingly ripe tomatoes, tender fresh leaves of young spinach, delicate and bright berries, hearty cuts of richly orange-fleshed potatoes, and all manner of other fresh fruits and vegetables. To the side, dark brown balls that Medusa had said was a construction of some mashed and fried bean stood in a neat pile, smelling of exotic spices that Kendra could not name. Near a half-dozen loaves of unleavened nut bread were stacked in a side compartment, packed away with the prize of the collection, a brick of weeping golden honeycomb, sweet as the chef herself. Holding back a tear, Kendra composed herself a pile of treasures and sat off to the side, savoring as she watched the rising moon. "You have to acknowledge it's strictly advantageous." "I think, Caleb, that you'll find I do not have to acknowledge any such thing, actually." "Oh, by the gods, Maya, obviously I'm not trying to be disrespectful to dwarves. When did being disrespectful ever stop you from doing anything? You stay out of this, Kendra. Now listen." The three sat pleasantly stuffed, as they had not been in a long time. Meals had been sparse during Kendra's journey, limited to whatever Caleb could forage as they went. Kendra was quickly losing what little baby fat remained to her, and Caleb's cheekbones had taken on a gaunt edge. Maya had also been hiding an impressive appetite. Apparently, something about dwarven metabolisms and periods of dormancy led to equally great periods of feasting. Together, they utterly routed the basket, leaving behind little more than scraps before settling around the campfire in a loose sprawl. The evening was cool, but the fire drove off the worst of it, and the skies were clear and velvety black, stars scattered like so many crumbs on a picnic blanket. Maya sat comfortably atop a boulder, looking as if she had been there for all of time, while Caleb paced and spoke animatedly. Kendra settled into the nook of a nearby tree, a few paces removed, and set to her book by the faint light of the fire, half listening. "It's simply more certain. Memories fade, but books, Maya, they're forever. So much is lost if you don't write it down." Kendra noticed with affection that his face was alight with excitement. "Pardon me for saying so, but books are not forever. It's just wispy scraps of wood in the end, not even as sturdy as tree bark." Maya, too, seemed to be quite enjoying herself, her rolling cadence back in full swing. "Do you know what is sturdy? A dwarf. And I expect that I'll remember things a fair sight better than you, because I'm not relying on dead bits of tree to tell me what happened yesterday." Caleb snorted. "Make fun of it all you like. Your memory might be good, but the written word is immutable, eternal. We know yesterday perfectly, and last year, and 100 generations ago. Can you make that claim?" His hands were waving passionately, almost theatrically, his eyes a lively brown. "My mother taught me, and her mother her, and so on forever," Maya said stubbornly. "Everything that we need to know, the wisdom of the ages, everything of importance is passed down, and without needing to carry around a room full of logs on our backs." "Oh, really?" Caleb asked skeptically. "Then I suppose you can tell me what the dwarvish people were doing 1,000 years ago, just after the lost kingdom of Coronon came into being and made their treaty with the fairy queen Ayara. Place them for me in history, would you?" Maya smiled wryly. "Well, that's easy, Caleb. We were planting mushrooms." Kendra chuckled as his face fell, disgruntled. "You talk to her, Kendra," he said in disgust. "You're a young lady of culture, well, for a human, anyway. A book lover, at any rate. Maybe you can make her see reason." "A book lover, I'll grant you, Caleb," Maya said, patient amusement writ large in her face. "She's been tucked away in that thing all night, but I think calling her human might be putting it strongly at this point." They both turned to her, consideringly. Kendra blushed under the scrutiny, before realizing, mortified, that her expressive ears had begun to droop. Hurriedly, she pulled up her hood. It was Caleb's turn to laugh, as Kendra hid her flustered discomfort. "Even better," he said, a broad grin prominently revealing his many pointed teeth. After composing herself, Kendra returned the smile shakily. "Well, I think it's probably rather, how to put it kindly, misguided, overzealous, to preach the virtues of scholarly pursuit to a blind woman. Clearly, she's getting by just fine, and has a way of living that works for her." She pressed on as he scowled, and Maya snorted. "But I do adore reading, regardless. I learn about places and things I've never seen. It connects me to people I've never met, across time and space. I felt alone for a long time, and my books were the only thing that made me feel like I had any sort of bond with anyone." She flushed again, and went quiet. She had said more than she had intended. But Caleb and Maya's smiles were gentle and kind in the firelight. The conversation lulled for a small, quiet moment, before Maya began again. "But even then, Kendra, meaning no offense, you really didn't know them. Words tell us so little, without the flavor and context of their teller. A story is a living thing, vibrant and full of emotion, but a book is dead. Its voice does not shake with rage, it cries no tears, it doesn't laugh. But when I tell the story of days gone by, of the chieftain Duwala and her defiance of Ayara, I speak with a voice passed from generation to generation. A story without a voice is hollow, heartless. I think that is why that book of yours causes you so much trouble. If you could but ask the storyteller a few questions, really hear them, I reckon it'd all be sorted out right quick. You're right, of course, Kendra admitted, her smile now distant. It's much harder this way. I wish I could hear it from them, if only because they seem to be a really fascinating person. The more I reread it, the more I can't believe this book exists. It seems to chronicle so much, across every corner of the garden. The amount of detail that goes into its descriptions is almost unbelievable. Whoever wrote it must have traveled up and down the whole place with a very thorough eye, but they hardly mention any of the monsters and dangers that they must have encountered. It doesn't seem to interest them in the slightest. Their perspective is so distinct, so specific. The more I read, the more I feel like I can hear their voice after all, if I listen carefully. It almost feels like I know them. I only wish they'd sign their name or something. Have you figured out anything new? Caleb asked, slinking behind her, looking down at the book thoughtfully. You've got more information out of that damn thing than I would have believed possible, and it's steered us true enough. Kendra pursed her lips, a little measure of her frustration slipping out. I don't know exactly, she said fretfully. I thought I knew where we were, but I think I must be wrong. I've been on the lookout for the signs that I was sure we'd have seen by now if we were going the right way, and I really thought I was starting to get a feel for what the rider was driving at. What have you been looking for? Asked Maya, fists stuck under her chin in an angular pose of relaxed concentration. Maybe we passed it without realizing. We've been moving proper quick. Kendra shook her head doubtfully. It ought to be pretty hard to miss. Based on the dimensions given, it should be quite big, maybe over a mile long. The description is of an enormous constructed basin of some sort, like a bed laid directly into the land. It's actually quite elaborate. The ground is tiled and reinforced, and the writers say it's been filigreed with gold and gems. It sounds quite beautiful for being a hole in the ground. I rather wish it said what it was for, though. She yawned, blinking blearily. She could suddenly feel the day catching up with her, hours of walking and looking and worrying, all exacting their toll. The book was an oddly comforting weight against her, its cover leathery soft from long years of wear, a fragile and venerable creature resting on her breast. We can get a better look at the area in the morning. Go further up the ridge, she offered, tugging a blanket up around herself. Sure, tomorrow. For now, rest up, Kendra, Maya said with a smile. You've had a pisser of a day, and no mistake. Quite right, Caleb agreed. I'm sure we can divvy up the watch between the two of us. Are you sure? Kendra asked. I could take... She trailed off, Caleb's strident expression more than answer enough, Maya chuckling tolerantly behind him. Thank you, Kendra mumbled, fatigue beating any further argument out of her. She rolled onto her side, pulling the thick volume tight against her chest. The fire was flickering warmly beyond her closed eyelids. As she slid into darkness, from far away she heard Caleb's voice rise in a fervent murmur. Now, Maya, say one of these wise and honored storytellers of yours slipped and hit their head. The forest trees loomed impossibly high over her, 1,000 shadowy and threatening figures. She was running, hard, her surroundings a manic blur, her heart pounding explosively until it felt as if it would surely burst from her ribs. She could taste fear, acrid on her tongue, like bile and blood. There was a nightmare behind her, wood splintering in its path, violent intentions promised in its thrashing pursuit, echoing to the rumbling of the storm. The ground suddenly fell away beneath her, and she was flying over open air, the night an impenetrable and inescapable snare of blackness. Lightning flashed, and in a moment of elongated clarity she saw herself. She was, in that moment, suspended over a mirror, and beheld her features, her pointed nose twitching and whiskered, her smooth pelt brown on white, her dark eyes bulging in terror. Then she was falling again, and the mirror broke into murky, icy water. She kicked her 4 legs furiously, bringing herself bursting forth to the surface amid the inky darkness. All around her was noise, calamitous and disorienting, ringing painfully in her long, sensitive ears. Then silence. She could hear nothing, see nothing, paddling desperately in that black sea. Not far off, a splash came. She squealed and kicked, made to flee, but in the void of her unknowable surroundings she was not sure she was moving at all. Lightning flashed again, shattering the sky, painting the world in sudden stark white. Before her, rising over her out of the dark and turbulent water, was that haunting smile, too wide, eyes terribly blank under a shock of red hair. But there was a new addition to the familiar features that had once been Thomas. The face was gruesomely burnt on one side, skin mutilated and ragged. As she floated, paralyzed in its gaze, its hand went to the burn, began to claw at the edges, tearing it away in grisly chunks. Bit by bit, a new, smiling rictus was unveiled, and Kendra screamed as her own awful, unmistakable face leered down at her. She was still screaming as the bloody hands pushed her under, water pouring chokingly down her throat. "Kendra!" She awoke to a keening shriek, fading now until she clenched her hands over her mouth. Spittle smeared under her fingers where it had spilled over her cheeks from her ruined lips. She felt sickly slick, mortal terror running cold sweat down her back as if she had only just been pulled from the icy water. Slowly, as her choked breaths eased, blurred shapes hanging over her resolved into a face. Caleb was rocking her shoulder to wakefulness, his expression turned down in a look that was too much like pity. She twisted away, wiping her face, miserable. "What's the matter?" she mumbled through sleep-heavy lips. I'm sorry I screamed." She could feel Caleb's eyes on her, but he said nothing for a few moments, his hand resting on her shoulder. It was a gesture of comfort, and it made her stomach turn. "Don't worry about it," he said finally. "It only started when I woke you." He faltered a moment longer, in uncharacteristic uncertainty. "Please don't try to be sympathetic," she said, her disgust bubbling over and outwards. "It doesn't suit you." She could not raise her head, could not meet those eyes that said all those things that she already knew full well. "We have to be moving on now," Caleb managed in a poor imitation of his usual aloof tone. That's why I woke you." Kendra swallowed, then swung her head round, looking about. "It's hardly dawn yet," she objected. Long shadows still lay over their campsite, just the barest hint of a white glow in the east peeking through the broad-leafed trees. "We're out of time," he said bleakly. "The moon is gone." Kendra looked up uncomprehendingly before a chill ran through her. The night sky, only hours before a tapestry of brilliant points of light over immaculate sable, had grown indistinct. Clouds had set the colors running murky and unclean from the north, and were now hanging nearly over them. Darkness had swallowed up the fair face of the moon that had been smiling down on her when she had closed her eyes. And not far now, as if an echo of her nightmares, Kendra heard the rumble of thunder. "How?" she asked in a shaken whisper. "We made good time yesterday. The storm wasn't that close before, not at all. Damn it, it was just a few hours ago." "It's speeding up." Maya's voice came now out of the black dawn amid a cascade of slipping and falling pebbles. "Might be that the sisters are getting impatient waiting for us." Kendra flinched. "Enough of that," Caleb snapped, sudden sparks in his voice. "Did you find a way up the ridge?" "I did," she replied, as coolly brisk as he was heated. "Are you ready?" Caleb looked to Kendra with some unspoken anxiety. "I wanted to take a quick look around before we go. If we get up to higher ground, we can get the lay of the land a bit better, maybe find that basin of yours. Are you—" Eyes downcast, she nodded, and stood sharply. "Lead the way, Maya." They clambered up the rocky slope with some difficulty. The ground had an odd give to it, and the plant life that might have been handholds hung in bedraggled patches. Kendra climbed with difficulty, fear pressing on her shoulders like a physical weight, until suddenly the incline eased. They came to a plateau, and a clean pre-dawn wind fell on their faces out of the south. She breathed deeply, and then began to march with purpose toward the odd pinnacle that pierced the canopy of the surrounding lowlands. The terrain was strangely rolling, forming rows of craggy banks, but before long they were at its base. It was difficult to see far in the faint light, night still clinging to the land. She strained her eyes, but it all faded into a gray-green sea of indistinct shapes, rising and falling, murky and ominous to the edge of her vision. After several moments she scoffed impatiently, and grabbed the jutting peak, tapering up pointed and vertical like a long nose. With a sense of shimmying up the mast of some great ship, she shuffled along, neck craning up, until, with a sudden shock, the first ray of dawn caught her straight on. Squinting searchingly, she looked down into the garden. The forest rolled away from her into the south, pulling up and down in waves, and every so often cresting to some mighty peak. She squinted intently, trying to compare the hazy vista to the disjointed map conjured up by the meanderings of her guidebook. All the while, the storm loomed at her back, crackling with barely contained menace. Finally, Kendra dropped her gaze and placed her head in her hands, lost for a moment in turbulent thoughts. It was hard to tell for certain, and none of it quite fit the image she had been slowly piecing together in her mind's eye. The sunken bed ought to be here. As she ran through it all again, her eyes wandered idly to her feet, barely seeing. A strange thought struck her, and her brow furrowed. Then Kendra gasped. "Go," she said in a small voice that did not properly leave her throat. She dropped down off the spire, then looked urgently to Maya and Caleb. "We have to go," she repeated, her voice now coming in a strong whisper, an edge of panic cutting through her dreamlike sense of stunned euphoria. Caleb looked at her quizzically. What? What did you see? Kendra shook her head hurriedly, words failing her, and he huffed in agitation. But Maya had a look of supreme concentration, listening to something that only she could hear. Then her shoulders tensed in sudden epiphany. Caleb, she said in a low hiss, we should get down now, and we should get down very carefully and quietly. He stared, confounded for a moment longer, before nodding his acceptance and putting their words to action. Nimbly, he began to scale directly down the nearest cliff face, clever feet finding tiny points of purchase against the rock face. What's this about? He breathed, helping Kendra down the steep slope with a look of half-concealed anxiety. She slid clumsily into his waiting arms and paused for a moment, looking up into his eyes as her mind swam with the tenuous unreality of it. When she spoke, it was with the detached clarity that she did not feel. We're not on a hill, Caleb. They made their swift descent and fled some ways before Kendra could set her mind to any coherent consideration again. She skidded to a stop and crouched low for a moment, breathing hard, her hands running through her hair, the disconcertingly alien feel of the ears going almost unnoticed in the stream of her rushing thoughts. She was dimly aware of the shapes of her companions hovering near at hand, making noises she could not understand. Caleb, she finally said, her voice coming rough and raw, we have to pick up the trail again, quickly. Kendra, what the hell is... Please... For just a moment, her frayed nerves snapped in a harsh cry, before subsiding weakly into more controlled tones. Please, Caleb, I'll explain as we go. Just find it. There were several long moments of silence, broken only by the ponderous ruminations of the storm. Then Caleb sighed and beckoned. They went warily on, moving now at a measured pace beneath the cold, early morning shadows of the forest. We found the basin, Kendra began abruptly, some minutes later. I know where we are now. It makes sense. I just hadn't realized, because it had been filled in. Caleb did not look up, the attention of his glinting eyes utterly focused into the misty undergrowth. By what? What would fill it in? He had a predatory lean about his gait, his nose to the ground, a prowling hunter on the scent. She watched him, absorbed for several moments, before he turned up to her inquiringly, the dull fire of his gaze piercing her. Kendra? She fought back a shiver. It was a bed, she said unbelievingly, an exhilarated little giggle bubbling out before she could stifle it. The basin was constructed as a bed, back when the diagrams were made. Now, there's something sleeping there. Silence fell over them. In her mind, Kendra tried to grapple with the enormity of that thing that she had stood atop of. Even from astride it, she could not picture it in its entirety. It was simply staggering. I think it's been sleeping there for a very long time, she added, trying to shake herself from her daze. It must have been ages, Caleb said slowly, his voice heavy with hidden considerations. There's nothing in Elvish records about anything that large in any histories I've seen. For something on that scale to be missing from the archive would suggest that it's been there for... He paused, his shoulders suddenly tense. Found you, he whispered, a hungry light in his eyes. He rose triumphantly from his search, wearing a satisfied and sharp grin. "I've picked up the trail. This woman is something, I'll give her that. I'd have sworn there was no trail at all for a while there, but I've got her number now. She's heading east." He trailed off, sagging with the same realization now playing through Kendra's mind. "She's going towards the sisters," Kendra murmured, an unwilling admission. "I beg your pardon," Maya broke in loudly. She had said nothing for some time, withdrawn and taciturn, but now there was an energy about her, a clarity. "Kendra, did you say what I think you did?" Slowly, Kendra nodded. "I got a pretty good look around up there. It took a little while to work it all out, because I thought we were missing a landmark, but I can see it now. I understand." She crossed her arms, a faraway look in her eye. "There are some large structures that peer over the treetops away into the east. 2 of them, right by each other. I think it has to be the towers, the citadels of the sisters." "But this is perfect!" Maya crowed. She sprang forward and slammed her arms into her chest in a foreign gesture that clearly conveyed some profound delight. "This Moira of yours is going in exactly the right direction. If we follow along now, we'll scoop her up on the way and arrive at the citadels in no time at all." "I suppose you're right," Kendra admitted, her throat suddenly dry. There was a sense of dread settling into her gut, of lost time. Judgment was coming, certain and inevitable, faster than she could have believed. "I'm not sure if—" "We can't go that way." Caleb's words were hard and sharp, brooking no argument. He surveyed them now with his arms crossed, almost daring an objection. "Why is that now?" Maya asked him, utterly cool, her face an impassive porcelain mask across from Caleb's confrontational glare. "Because the storm front is pushing out of the north," he said, now mirroring her flatness. "Leave aside that it was always a damn fool chase. If we turn to follow the trail, if we keep pushing mindlessly towards the citadels, we'll be caught in the storm. And every time we've been in that storm, that thing, the face-stealer, has caught up to us." There was an ominous flare in his look, but his words remained clear and clipped. "So it's time to move on to realistic prospects. Kendra, you saw something else, didn't you? In the south." Kendra licked her lips before nodding hesitantly. She could feel both their attentions skewering her, pins through a displayed insect. "There's something there in the south, maybe a few days away. It's like a smudge in the distance. It was at the edge of my vision, so it's not completely clear, but the canopy thins out and it gets hazy and gray." "It's the tears, isn't it?" It was not a question. Hand to her mouth, Kendra nodded again. It was hard to breathe. She had the sense of being trapped in tar, forces beyond her control pulling at her. But Caleb looked away, a blazing surety in his eye. "So that's it then," he said with a casual finality. "The tears are within a few days' march if we keep going south. The borders of the garden are within reach. We can stay ahead of the storm and get Kendra to safety. We're almost there, and there's no sense in getting caught up in distractions." "Distractions is an interesting way to put it," Maya said, with an evenness that was not reflected in her crossed arms and spread feet. "What about Moira? We're done tracking her now? We're going to leave her to the tender mercies of the garden?" "I tracked her far enough," Caleb spat. "This human woman ran for an entire day and night and is about to be caught up in a garden storm. By the time we do catch up to her, we'll be lucky to get out ourselves, let alone retrieve her corpse. We've done what we could, and I'm no longer especially worried about her at this point. I'm worried about Kendra." Maya laughed, cold and mirthless. "Well, isn't that convenient? You can't help this woman, or deliver the word of fell deeds afoot to the matrons of the land. You don't have time to do what's right. No, you've got to protect Kendra and damn everything else. And if it happens to keep your skin safe, if it happens to be the easy course, well, that's just a little side benefit." Caleb's eyes blazed with bloodthirsty crimson. "Are you calling me a coward?" he asked, deadly quiet. He was flexing his clawed hands at his sides, twitching with barely controlled fury. Maya smiled thinly back at him. "What would you call a man who does nothing but run away, Mr. Caleb?" He was moving forward, quick and menacing, when Kendra interposed herself between the two. "Enough!" She stared pleadingly into Caleb's eyes, flashing with a promise of violence. She swallowed hard, but met that gaze, until, with a grinding of teeth, he halted his approach. "Enough, both of you. Maya, don't antagonize him. Caleb is trying to keep us safe, just like he always has. He's just trying to think about what's best for all of us." "He's trying to think about what's best for you," Maya said coldly. "I can see why you'd like to think that those are the same thing, but I think you'll find that's not quite the case. It's not what's best for Moira. It's not what's best for the sisters, who might not even know that a familiar is dead. And it's not what's best for those that are trying to make a life here, while things are going to hell in a handbasket." "I know, Maya, I know. I wish there were more I could do, but I don't see how I could—" Kendra's voice trembled and died as she met the dwarf's look of naked disgust. "So, you want to run away too? You'll go find some new life and leave all this behind you. I suppose you'll take to wearing hats, and no one will be the wiser about what you've become. And we'll just deal with the mess you've made. Is that it?" She was pushing her hair from her face in short, agitated movements, her breaths sharp and shallow. "My people have been reduced to horrors, and I don't know if there's anything that can save them. The thing that did it is loose in the garden, killing unchecked under a storm that's covering the land. And the familiars, the eyes and ears of the sisters, are dead or incapacitated. Need I remind you of your role in that?" There were tears now in Kendra's eyes, but Maya pushed on, her voice spiraling up in an uncontrolled diatribe. "I don't even know why I'm surprised. What else should I expect from a human but selfishness? What do our troubles matter to you? You move on and never think of any of us ever again, while we're left to stumble in the dark all alone. Is that it, Boris? You're just going to abandon me?" Kendra blinked, watching the dwarf in confusion. Her pale cheeks held a flush she could see even in starlight, and she had a glazed look, as if barely present. But even as Kendra watched, Caleb was pushing past her, grabbing Maya by the collar. His eyes blazed like furnaces, twin points of burning rage in the night. "That's enough!" he shouted in her face, spittle flying from his mouth. "Leave her alone, you stone-hearted bitch! She's not responsible for your problems or your crusade. If you get her wrapped up in this, if you get her hurt, I swear I'll kill you where you stand." "Like you bloody well care, elf!" Maya cried back shrilly. You and yours are perfectly content to sit back and watch the world burn for years and years, but now you want me to believe you've gone soft over a lost child? You don't care how many people suffer and die as long as you can sit above it all, safe and comfortable." Kendra saw his hand fly into the air, his claws bared, his face a snarling mask of fury. "No!" she screamed, grabbing desperately for his shoulder. "Stop it! Stop!" He turned faster than she could have believed, his eyes flashing like a wild animal. With savage speed, his clawed fingers cut open the frozen morning air, screaming bloody music. Kendra found herself on the ground, sitting in a stunned heap among dewy ferns that soaked through her clothes like icy tendrils. Sound was peculiarly dulled, as if she sat alone at the end of some great echoing chamber. Her face was wet also. She could feel it, hot liquid flowing in a slow, pulsing drip. She raised a palm and rubbed at the spot, before gasping with suddenly realized pain. There was yelling somewhere nearby as she looked dazedly at her reddened fingers and felt the hot blood pouring off her cheeks. A pile of limbs fell through her gaze, landing a few paces before her feet. Maya was atop Caleb, hot anger radiating off her like a statue in the glaring midday sun. Beneath her, Caleb hardly moved, sprawled unresisting, his eyes drawn to her, staring in dawning horror. Kendra looked back searchingly. She could not quite understand what was happening, his face blurring strangely. For a moment he almost looked like Adrian on that night, disbelieving, heart-wrenched, and terribly lost. Then a fresh throb of pain burned across her face, and the ringing in her ears faded, sinking her back into herself. She flinched away from Maya's steady stream of curses, but mostly away from that stare. That look was more than she could bear. "Crazy bastard!" Maya yelled. "What the hell do you think you—" "Maya," Kendra interrupted, surprised by the steadiness of the voice that passed like a stranger's from her lips. "Let him up." She looked up from where she sat astride his back, dumbfounded. "What? Kendra, you can't possibly think I'll just stand by after he did something like that. He's dangerous." "Are you here, Caleb?" Kendra asked, quiet and clear, ignoring Maya's continued objections. He no longer met her eyes, but after a few moments he nodded. "Maya, off him." "You can't trust him! Sisters, save us! Look at what he did!" Kendra smiled, hollow and haggard. "I had my guts torn out of me 2 days ago. I imagine I'll be just fine. Besides, I don't think anyone will notice a few more scars on a face like mine. Let him up." The dwarf picked herself up off Caleb, slow and furious. "Of course. He's going to take you home. He'll keep you nice and safe." She shook her head in disbelief. "So, even after all that, you're going to listen to him?" "No," Kendra said simply. She pulled her hand from her face. The bleeding was already slowing, the pain dulling to a sharp sting. "I agree with you. I have to do what's right. I owe a lot to too many people to run now, whatever else happens." Maya looked taken aback, but Kendra turned from her now to look down. Caleb was still sitting, cradling his right hand. It was still dripping with her blood. "Caleb, you'll pick up the trail? You'll find her for me?" She could hardly believe her own serene calm as she looked down at him. His eyes, she noticed distantly, had cooled to a murky crimson. He still did not meet her gaze, but dusted himself off as he rose, sending a streak of blood down the front of his jacket. Silently, He nodded, before turning away and walking into the deeper shadows beneath the trees. Kendra watched him go solemnly. Then she shook herself and gave Maya a twisted little smile, wiping some of the blood from her cheeks. "Don't worry, Maya. I'll be all right. I'll make this right, however I can. I promise." She clapped the stunned woman on the shoulder and began to follow behind him. Maya frowned uncertainly, then stomped after them into the darkness of the pre-dawn. Nigh upon them, thunder rumbled. Clouds fell over the slumbering giant, a blanket of earth over a fresh grave, until it had disappeared into the mists behind them. The last twinklings of a dawn that never truly came choked out and died as the storm crept over them.